The first of our speakers is my colleague from the Acton Institute, Dr. Samuel Gregg, who serves as the Director of Research at the Institute. The title of his remarks is God, Reason, and Our Civilizational Crisis. Dr. Gregg.
Thank you, Father Sirico. It is good to be with you this afternoon. It's wonderful to be back once again in Argentina and once again at the Pontifical Catholic University of Argentina, and to see old friends and to meet some new friends as well. The subject of our reflections today is Christianity's contribution to the growth of freedom and free societies, and more specifically, political, religious, and economic freedom. This subject needs more attention, not least because it is arguable that many people have become, shall we say, preoccupied, even fixated in recent years with a different subject, that being equality. Not so much the idea of equality in dignity, first clearly expressed in the Hebrew Scriptures through the concept of all men being made as imago Dei. Rather, they have in mind equality in the sense of sameness of result, especially equal economic outcomes. In some instances, it has become difficult to distinguish particular Christian contributions to discussions about economic inequality from those of very secular-minded people, whose guiding principles seem far more rooted in the thought of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and what I like to call sentimental humanitarianism, rather than right reason and natural law. This in turn points to a more general issue about freedom, the institutions of liberty, and Christianity. One of the ways in which Christianity, I would argue, has contributed to the growth of freedom is through its critical, if not unique, role in promoting natural law as the foundation of key principles and institutions that are central for free societies. Today, I would like to illustrate why I think this is the case and why any loss of Christian attention to natural law can only have very negative implications for freedom. And the place I would like to begin my reflections is with how we understand the nature of God and the significance of this for maintaining a culture of freedom. Now, as I suspect many of you know, the word culture is derived from the Latin cultus. This broadly means religious customs or rites. This illustrates that religion, in the sense of views about the deity, is truly at the heart of any culture. A particular religion's conception of God thus cannot help but influence the cultures in which that faith prevails. The ancient world, for example, generally lacked the biblical notion of God as the creator. Consequently, it did not view humans as co-creators working to unfold an unfinished creation in human history. This is one reason why the Greeks and the Romans, unlike the Jews, viewed manual work and commerce as the responsibility of slaves, women, and other non-citizens. Equally important, however, is the way a religion's understanding of God impacts its appreciation for man's capacity for reason. This theme was central to Benedict XVI's discussion of the relationship between violence and religion in his 2006 Regensburg address. If a religion does not regard God at some level as logos, as divine reason, rather than just an unmediated raw will, then that faith's capacity to dispute the reasonableness of those who, for example, decapitate Christian hostages, burn prisoners of war to death, shoot cartoonists, slaughter Jews shopping in kosher markets, and then claim religious warrants for doing so is, at best, questionable. In his 1951 book, Man and the State, the philosopher Jacques Maritain argued that it was necessary on a political level for all faiths and philosophies to agree that violence is irrational. The focus, however, should not, he said, be upon why any particular religion or philosophy might believe this to be the case. Yet Maritain himself conceded that sooner or later, different religions and philosophies needed to address the issue of violence and religion at the level of theory, if any agreement not to use violence was to hold politically. Now, most contemporary discussion of these issues has focused, with good reason, upon the connection between Islam's view of God and Islamic violence. Less attention, however, has been paid to the way in which the West's own loss of a sense of God as logos helps explain why much of the West seems to be living in what the American natural law philosopher Robert George aptly describes as, quote, an age of feelings, end quote. Violence isn't, after all, the only way in which profound irrationality can be expressed. The two faiths at the core of Western culture, Judaism and Christianity, have long held that man is the imago Dei. It's worth asking, however, what happens to the way the West understands man's specific qualities as imago if the Deus becomes conceptualized primarily as a bundle of emotions and empathy instincts. To different degrees and in varying ways, Judaism and Christianity express understandings of the divine which accord significant places to love. But when the God who reveals himself to Moses names himself as I am, this underscores that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob isn't a fable. In other words, an account of the world that doesn't conform to reality. Instead, Yahweh's very being can be understood, albeit in limited ways, by man through the light of his reason. Appreciation of this insight may help account for why the Jews understood certain things far more clearly and earlier than the Greeks. As another contemporary natural law philosopher, John Finnis, pointed out in his 2014 Anscombe Memorial Lecture, quote, the Jewish people and their true prophets, in fact, reached a settled and superior understanding of the universe's origins and of its natural intelligibility centuries earlier than the Greeks and their philosophers reached their own standard and, in substance, inferior understanding, end quote. Now, Christianity is very explicit that caritas surpasses knowledge. But Christianity's God of love doesn't cease to be logos. The use of the expression the Word at the beginning of John's Gospel reminded its heavily Gentile audiences that this Gospel was a communication of divine reason. And only created beings graced with natural reason can be receptive to such a deity. Likewise, St. Paul's reference in his letter to the Romans to the law inscribed on all people's hearts led many of the earliest Christian thinkers, such as Theophilus of Antioch and Irenaeus, to immediately draw links between the Decalogue given to Israel by I am, a Decalogue forcefully reaffirmed by Christ and Paul, especially the negative commandments inscribed on the second tablet, and the idea of natural law written into man's very reason itself. Once, however, logos as a prominent dimension of God's nature starts fading from Western culture's horizons, what is left? There appear to be three possibilities. One is God as will, but untethered to reason. This is a God who acts arbitrarily, one who we must simply obey. Freedom is thus found in unquestioning submission, no matter how irrational the divine command. Another is God as love, but without reasonableness. This is a God who, like an irresponsible parent, simply affirms his child's choices, no matter how foolish or evil such decisions might be. A third possibility is God beyond reason. This produces a narrowed understanding of reason itself, one that confines our rationality to the verifiable scientific method and thereby declines to permit reason to ponder the bigger questions opened by the intriguing possibility that divine reason exists. If any of these conceptions of God prevail in a culture, we can hardly be surprised that attempts to answer why we make particular choices, moral, political, legal, and economic choices, or why we think freedom is important, they become reduced to strongly felt feelings, utilitarian calculations, or more recently what the philosopher Tyler Berg calls neurobabble. Instead of seeking rational resolution of problems, we increasingly defer to reigning majority opinion, panels of experts, the posturing of populist politicians, consequentialist rationalizations devised to legitimize all sorts of evil, or some type of force, whether expressed through democratically elected temporary majorities or outright coercion. But herein lies my central point. Notions of natural law and right reason become much harder to comprehend in these circumstances. After all, if the God who created man is an irrational entity or just another sentimental humanitarian, why should we expect humans to be reasonable? Why should we expect people to make rational choices? Why should we care if people are free or unfree? What makes humans different from animals and opens up the very possibility of civilization in the first place is our capacity for natural reason and free choice. These enable us to resist our baser predispositions, to know the good, and then to freely choose it. Yet it is very challenging for a culture to sustain this specific vision of reason and free choice if it conceptualizes God as a cosmic will capable of contradicting himself, or as a celestial teddy bear whose prime responsibility is to cuddle us, or as a supreme watchmaker who allows us to discover the mechanics of how things work, but doesn't regard us as worthy of knowing his deeper reasons for creating the world. Now today, the Islamic world is struggling with a particularly virulent God problem. For everyone else, this matters, because while we can protect ourselves to an extent against those who want us to submit to a thoroughly voluntaristic vision of a God who acts unreasonably, at some point, the cessation of Muslim violence is going to require many Muslims to change their minds about God's nature. Yet, anyone who cares about Western civilization should also remember that no matter how materially prosperous and technologically advanced we become, or how much we celebrate concepts such as rule of law, the coherence of these achievements will become increasingly tenuous if our culture-forming institutions, ranging from families and universities to synagogues and churches, continue embracing sentimentalist conceptions of God. In that regard, I would suggest there's a real danger that the present emphasis on mercy in the church could easily degenerate, and in some cases already has degenerated, into an understanding of love devoid of reason. And this in turn threatens the very coherence of a number of institutions that promote liberty. Let me give you one example. It concerns a key idea that is especially important for political and economic freedom. I'm referring to the values, institutions, and protocols associated with what we call rule of law. Back in 2012, the financier George Soros and the head of one of the world's largest anti-poverty NGOs, Faisal Hassan Abed, pointed out in the Financial Times that despite the Great Recession, the number of people living in extreme poverty had fallen in every region of the world for the first time since record keeping had begun. That story, and many others concerning measurable declines in poverty and measurable declines in economic inequality as more people participate in global markets, these stories are often ignored today, including by many Christians. Why? Well, one reason is that such developments don't fit the populist narratives and demonstrably false, I say again, demonstrably false claims that global economic inequality is increasing. Soros and Abed, however, then argued that the road out of poverty was fundamentally compromised by the absence of the rule of law in many developing countries. Quote, "Poverty," they claimed, "will only be defeated when the law works for everyone." End quote. If that's true, then countries like China and India, which have taken hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in recent decades, but which also rank very low on virtually every rule of law index, still face significant challenges. Now, the wider background to this growing attentiveness to the rule of law's significance in reducing poverty is a realization that, one, widening access to global growth's benefits, and two, maintaining prosperity have far less to do with wealth redistribution than with a country's institutional settings. More work, however, is needed to understand the ways in which value choices affect the type of institutions that emerge, how they function, and their impact on problems such as poverty. Now, legal philosophers have long been divided about how much moral capital is invested in the idea of the rule of law. In the 1960s, for example, the Harvard legal philosopher Lon Fuller argued in his book, The Morality of Law, that the criteria he associated with the rule of law, such as that legal rules are prospective, not retroactive, rules are promulgated and are clear and coherent, rules are not impossible to comply with, etc., to name just a few, that this reflected a type of inner morality and made it harder for tyrants to get their way. Now, Fuller's position was criticized by Oxford's H.L.A. Hart. Hart claimed that such processes, as valuable as they are, had not significantly inhibited unjust regimes such as National Socialist Germany from pursuing diabolical ends. Fuller's response was to insist that no tyranny had ever developed where rule of law was truly maintained. Now, the fact that strong rule of law generally correlates with greater economic prosperity for all seems very hard to deny. Such conditions are more conducive, for example, for attracting foreign investment. But here is my point. If the only moral grounding for the rule of law is its wealth-enhancing potential, it could theoretically be nullified by governments that insist that different arrangements would facilitate more rapid economic development. This isn't as unlikely a scenario as some imagine. Many 20th century communist regimes and Marxist legal philosophers derided rule of law as a, quote, bourgeois device, end quote, designed to keep the proletariat in their place. As an alternative, they proposed legal systems built on the people's justice or socialist justice, constructs that, in the name of seeking to create better economic conditions for those in need, legitimized the inflicting of vast, systematic injustices upon millions of people. So what then might be deeper foundations, deeper moral foundations for the rule of law that support but go beyond the benefits of economic growth? Two seem especially pertinent. The Scottish founder of modern economics, Adam Smith, observed long ago that the economic well-being of an industrious and frugal peasant in 18th century Western Europe was probably less than that of a European prince, but would certainly exceed, quote, that of many an African king, the absolute master of the lives and liberties of 10,000 naked savages, end quote. Now here, Smith is making a point about relative poverty. But it's not simply the material differences to which Smith is alluding. Smith's European peasant isn't just better off than the African tyrant and his subjects because he's wealthier than they are. Smith's European peasant is also a free man, thanks partly to the rule of law. Unlike those under the African king, the state cannot do whatever it likes to the European peasant. Rule of law is thus rooted in the value of the liberty it provides each person through the substantive equality it accords everyone before the law. A second principle upon which rule of law is grounded becomes apparent when we realize that all the conditions that constitute rule of law underscore a commitment to non-arbitrariness. In other words, there are reasonable ways of acting. It's unreasonable, for instance, to pass laws with which no one can comply. In short, a moral good from which the rule of law derives its inner coherence is reason itself. It is the type of reason that allows us to say that this head of state is acting unjustly when she acts extra-constitutionally, while that judge is acting reasonably when he recuses himself from a case in which he is seen to have a conflict of interest. So, at the core of the rule of law's reliance upon commitments to goods such as freedom and reason is another key revelation. We expect the law's inner workings to be underpinned by reason and to facilitate human freedom because we think there is something distinct about all human beings that makes them worthy, dignos of such treatment. That should remind us why we want as many people as possible to escape the material poverty that attracts our sympathy. It shouldn't be just simply because we don't want people to suffer. Though that's important, our commitment to fighting something like poverty should also reflect a conviction that human beings are free, they do possess reason, and therefore are capable of flourishing, including in the economy. In short, rule of law reflects a moral investment in legal systems that fit the truth that humans are rational and free people. So therein lies a message for anyone who's concerned about poverty. If we want to be coherent when addressing poverty, rather than populists or just another sentimental do-gooder, our concerns can't be rooted in emotivist, skeptical, or relativistic accounts of who human beings are. If people become subject to arbitrary rule or backbreaking material poverty, that should be seen as an infringement of their reason and their freedom, and therefore a violation of their dignity. The very same dignity also provides direction to the ways in which we seek to realize conditions that provide some minimal economic certainty while preserving the space that people need to use their reason and their freedom to flourish in the economy. This should also turn anyone concerned about poverty away from focusing almost exclusively upon redistribution and towards realizing that, as the economist Julian Simon put it, man is indeed man's greatest resource. And this is true not just economically, but also in terms of man's unique capacity to know the basic moral goods upon which our most effective poverty-reducing institutions rely for their very rationality. To put it simply, poverty reduction is very difficult without rule of law. But rule of law is in turn very difficult to maintain over the long term without grounding in natural law. And natural law in turn depends upon an understanding that God is logos. God is divine reason. It follows that sentimentalist conceptions of God undermine the idea of rule of law, which in turn undermines the idea of the rule of law, which in turn undermines a society's freedom and its capacity to reduce poverty. God, it turns out, really matters, especially our understanding of who he is. So, if Catholics and other Christians are serious about all these things, it seems that one way they can contribute to the protection and revival of freedom, political freedom, religious freedom, and economic freedom, is to engage natural theology and natural law far more seriously. Because, if I may be controversial for a moment, if we are honest with ourselves, I think we should recognize that knowledge of basic principles of natural law, the teaching of natural law, and the understanding of natural law has visibly withered in much of the Catholic Church since the 1960s. On one level, this is puzzling, given that as important a document of the Second Vatican Council, the Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, is grounded very clearly on arguments based not on relativism, not on John Locke's notions of tolerance, not on liberalism, but rather on natural law. According to Dignitatis Humanae, religious liberty is a natural right grounded in the truth, knowable by human reason, that man is a truth seeker, including the truth about God and the ultimate meaning of life, and that man needs the freedom to seek this truth free from the threat of unreasonable coercion. The Council was also very clear that the limits of religious liberty and the state's specific responsibilities in regulating religious liberty are also derived from natural law. Now, there are some exceptions to this widespread neglect of natural law in the Church today. In the Anglo-Saxon Catholic world, for example, natural law thinking has undergone a profound revival over the past 30 years. This has added considerable focus, coherence, and clarity to the Church's engagement in the public square that is not so easy to detect, for instance, in whatever's left of continental Western European Catholicism. Perhaps the Pope who has most underscored this point is the one whom I'm convinced will one day be a doctor of the Church. In a series of addresses, Regensburg, Paris, London, Berlin, this great Pope stressed again and again that the maintenance of freedom and free societies depends upon broadening our conceptions of reason and, quote, overcoming the self-imposed limitation of reason to the empirically falsifiable, end quote. And here, Pope Benedict pointed to theology as having a critical role to play, not merely as a historical discipline, and certainly not as a way of rationalizing the rampant sentimentalism that is currently damaging the Church and destroying the West from within. Rather, Benedict held theology should contribute to saving reason and therefore freedom, quote, precisely as theology, as inquiry into the rationality of faith, end quote. To conclude, if we care about freedom, whether it is political freedom, economic freedom, or religious freedom, we have to care about reason, and we have to care about the ultimate foundation of reason. The West, Benedict once wrote, quote, has long been endangered by aversion to the questions that underlie its rationality, end quote. To put it another way, and in the words of the Anglican theologian Ian Markham, quote, you cannot assume a rationality and then argue there is no foundation to that rationality. Either God and rationality go, or God and rationality stay. Either Nietzsche or Aquinas. That is our choice, end quote. And if freedom is to prevail, ladies and gentlemen, it's also a choice, I should say, that we need to make as well. Thank you.